Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Bobby and Chuck, also for putting this together. Having served as AHA president, I know that events like this don't just fall together. Although when you come to them as an attendee, you tend to think, oh, food, speakers, and you tend to forget all the hard work that goes into putting it together. So thank you both. And I've been wanting to meet Seth for a long time because I've seen his webpage and his productions, and isn't he an incredible talent? I think it's just I don't know if he's around to hear the compliment, but boy, we can't let him get away from this movement, right? We have to reel him in and make him part of everything. So I wanted to talk about a few things. Any of you who know me know that I consider myself a movement humanist, or movement atheist, if you will. Very much into the culture wars. I did not get involved in this movement so I could sit around in a church basement or a hall somewhere and complain about God belief. I very much see the movement as relevant to society and politics and everything else. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of equal rights for atheists, which, if you really think about it, is not a concept we tend to think of very often. And I wanted to talk about that subject in the context of this Massachusetts lawsuit, which will be going to the Supreme Judicial Court in this state in just a few days. Have many of you heard of that lawsuit? Are you familiar with it? Well, I'll be talking about it a little bit, and we can go into some detail about it in the Q&A. But you might ask, why is the concept of atheist equal rights important? We don't hear about it very much. We hear about church-state separation, but not so much atheist equal rights. But I would suggest to you the reason is just look around. Look at what's happened to this country over the last few decades, really, since the rise of the religious right. The state of affairs is really rather sad. The level of discourse, the political situation is just really depressing when you see presidential candidates launching their campaigns by filling football stadiums and praising Jesus. Does anyone stop and think about how weird that is? Even a few decades ago, that would have been unthinkable even in the Republican Party, right? I mean, the Republican Party was the home of Barry Goldwater, who thought the religious right were a bunch of kooks. That's what he called them. Remember, Earl Warren came from the Republican Party, right? It's just stunning that people kind of take it for granted. Well, that's the way it is. That's the crazy Republicans. And, you know, the Democrats, for all we say about them, oftentimes aren't a heck of a lot better when it comes to culture war issues. We saw the Obama administration file a brief in the case from New York in favor of sectarian prayers in public meetings. So it's a sad state of affairs. And we tend to think of the culture wars and the religious right as relevant only in the area of church-state separation. Like, wow, they're really tearing down the wall of separation. But I think we need to be mindful that it really goes much wider than that. In fact, I argue in Non-Believer Nation that there's really not any major area of public policy that is not negatively affected by the existence of the religious right. Education policy, we all know what's going on there, right? I mean, evolution education, science education in general, history even, right? They're rewriting the history books down in Texas, affecting the whole country, sex education, you name it. Move over to the subject of the environment. Global warming denial is really led very much by the religious right. I know the oil industry and there are corporate interests that affect it as well, but it wouldn't have the legs it has today without the religious right as kind of a grassroots global denial mechanism. Dominionism around this country is very much driving this idea that environmental sustainability is not anything we really need to worry about because the Bible tells us that God gave us the earth to exploit. This is a very real meme, if you will, that's circulating out there, and it's not just circulating on the fringes. At the higher levels of government we've seen this. Back in the 80s, we had James Watt as environmental secretary who basically believed what I just said. and he was in charge of protecting the environment. And it's just a very dangerous situation. Move into social issues, and we all know what's going on there, right? The abortion issue, LGBT rights. Where's the opposition coming from? Well, the church. It's the religious right. And it's not just abortion and gay rights. Even more issues that you would think we have gotten past, such as birth control. The birth control debate, if you will, is back in the year 2013 in this country. Rick Santorum, who has a serious chance of being on a major party ticket in this country, is anti-birth control. He thinks it's an evil. That should really give us pause. It should scare us. And think, I don't like to stand up and drive fear into people. I'm not that kind of a person. But we really, even looking at it rationally, we should be afraid. It's what's going on in this country. It's very scary. And of course, politics, as I said, it's not just Rick Perry, but people like Michelle Bachmann. I mean, she ran for president. Granted, she didn't get too close to the ticket, but she was a viable. She was on the stage debating. Michelle Bachmann. Sarah Palin was on a major ticket. Imagine that. If that election had swung a little bit and then something had happened to McCain, we weren't that far. If you think about it, from having her running this country. Scary stuff. So these are reasons that we need a secular emergence, and that's why I got involved in this movement, and I'm sure that's why many people in this room are involved in the movement as well. We really need to emerge as a demographic, as I say it. And there's a little sidebar I'd like to throw in here, because Bobby said I did have a little bit of time. Something that's not often talked about, and it's really just something I like to get off my chest, but it's not said, and we need to say it. There's blame to be placed for what happened in America, the rise of the religious right and the sorry state of affairs that I just described. And it's never mentioned, and I want to put it on the table. We can blame much of what's happened on the generation known as the baby boomers. That's not something I don't think that's been put in front of you very often, but it's very true. And now I'm not just dissing people, but I belong to this generation. That baby boom is defined as 1946 to 1964. So I come in at the tail end of the baby boom. But these people need to be called out, because maybe with a little guilt, they'll start realizing that there's something that needs to be done. After all, baby boomers are basically running this country right now, right? But think about it, if you will. We think of the baby boom in a certain way. We think, they basically created youth culture in this country, right? I mean, before the baby boom, there really wasn't the youth culture we have today with Barbies and everything else. They created the meme of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I've pointed that out before, and the baby boom has gotten applause for that. So I guess that there's some positive that they've injected into our culture. And of course, we associate the baby boom with a lot of really good things, like the civil rights marches, anti-war protests, right? Women's liberation, all came. These are things that we tend to associate with the baby boom generation. And the baby boomers like to talk about the age of communes, and just liberal ideas generally. So I think we tend to attach all these really cool liberal ideas to the baby boom generation, and they're very self-congratulatory about it, aren't they? If you're sitting around talking to a baby boomer, they'll say, yeah, we were really cool. We were pretty cool. Well, I think the operative word there, though, is were. Okay, and they don't get called out about it enough, because never has a generation been more misrepresented and overrated, I would put to you, than the baby boom generation. The truth is that after the boomers' brief youthful flirtation with liberalism and cool ideas, they went straight downhill, and I'll show you how. After the 1960s and the early 1970s, perhaps kind of strung out from the experience, that where did they go? Where did the baby boomers go? Well, they gravitated towards born-again Christianity quite a bit. In the mid to late 70s, there was a resurgence of born-again Christianity in this country, and the baby boomers were a big part of it. The baby boomers helped elect Ronald Reagan in 1980. If any of you are old enough to remember, or if you've studied history, you know, that was a pivotal moment in American history, a real turning point. Reagan made the word liberal a dirty word in America, which was a complete reversal from before that. The feeling before Reagan was that the country was heading in sort of a progressive liberal direction, maybe slowly, but it was getting there. The baby boomers put a GOP majority in Congress in 1994. That was the first time in over 4 decades that a Republican majority controlled the House of Representatives. Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House under their watch. Arguably, the baby boomers are the most reactionary, anti-intellectual generation that this country has known for a long, long time. And if you happen to be a baby boomer, don't think that I'm criticizing you personally, but this is a generational indictment, not a personal indictment. Their crowning achievement was George W. Bush, one of their own, I was going to say elected, but put in the White House. And let's face it, I mean, the man was really anti-intellectualism personified, wasn't he? I mean, he proudly mispronounced his words. He didn't just do it. He was kind of proud that he was not an intellectual. And the boomers, ironically enough, grew up in the heyday of American liberalism. Many of them went to college for very cheap. In California for free. If you're old enough to remember, there was a time in California where if you were a state resident, you could go to the state colleges and university for free. I mean, that's social democracy. That's progressive democracy that you would think an enlightened culture would kind of drive towards. Well, the baby boomers, soaked up all those benefits. Today, the millennial generation, goes to college for $40,000, $50,000 a year. They leave college with mountains of debt. Right? So they're chained to, this system that basically delivers them into a lousy economy with few jobs, low-paying jobs, with great indebtedness. Thank you, baby boomers, right? So I'm perhaps overselling the thesis, but the thesis is that, much of this mess results from the rise of the religious right, and we can really attribute much of this mess and the rise of the religious right to this generation that gets so much credit for being, really cool. Anyway, since 1980, America has become much more anti-intellectual, much more anti-egalitarian, if you will, much more corporatist, and much more anti-humanistic. And doesn't it bother you that today in America, today 2013, fundamentalist Christians can get elected very easily across much of the country, openly proclaiming that they think the world is less than 10,000 years old, while an atheist it's almost impossible to get elected in most of the country. Doesn't that bother us? And isn't that part of the reason many of us are here? I would venture to guess so. And we can really only reverse things by pushing, as I said at the beginning, for an emergence of secular Americans. We need to come out. I think Ellery had mentioned earlier that part of the idea was to model the LGBT movement, and I absolutely agree with that. I think he hit the nail right on the head. We need to be equal players with a place at the table. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Hopefully. Anyway, and if we're equal players, how do we get there? How do we fight for atheist equality? Well, let me give you the Massachusetts lawsuit as one example of how we move in this direction. And this lawsuit, you could, I guess from a strategic standpoint, you could say it's a legal strategy, but in the overall movement of atheist equality, maybe it's more of a tactic. I'll explain it this way. When most minority groups, and we're talking racial minorities, women, ethnic groups, assert their rights in the court, what they usually do legally is they use the avenue of equal protection, okay? Equal rights. A great example, and the one we all know, is Brown versus Board of Education, right? A minority group goes in and they say, discrimination happening here, separate is inherently unequal, and of course in Brown in 1954 the court agreed, but that was equal protection in action. It's one of the first real meaningful equal protection suits. Atheists, though, if you think about it, have never used equal protection as a legal strategy. Instead, atheists always use this wall of separation argument. The First Amendment is there with the Establishment Clause, So we come charging in saying, you know, that's a violation of church-state separation. And it's great when it works. If you've got the right judges and the right courts, it's an argument that should work. And what we know from Ellery Shemp's example, 1963, his Bible reading case, there was a time when the courts were really on board with church-state separation. The Engel case the year before, 1962, got school-sponsored prayer removed from public schools. So the Establishment Clause is not something we want to forget about and never use, but we need to be mindful that there are several problems, or at least challenges, utilizing the Establishment Clause, especially today. One such challenge is that conservative courts today are less sympathetic to Establishment Clause arguments. Now they're kicking cases out on standing. You know, a valid church-state complaint, but the plaintiff gets knocked out on standing, unlike they would have in years past. And we also see just the interpretation of the Establishment Clause with these conservative judges moving. It's a moving target. Vouchers are a good example. Okay, there was a time when parochial school vouchers were absolutely considered a violation of church-state separation. No way. But now, you know, maybe not so much. These judges are looking at it anew. So there's that problem. Another problem with the Establishment Clause is that when you bring an Establishment Clause case, you are inevitably going to face these arguments about the intent of the founders. Now, if we have that argument thoroughly, we would win anyway, because the intent of the founders was secular government, as is, Ellery went over this in some detail, but nonetheless, they can cherry pick quotes, and if you really want to make the argument that the founders were tolerant of religion and government, there's a few things you can cherry pick, and you can muddy the waters, and it becomes a debate instead of something where either side wins. You'll notice, though, that with these other areas of equal rights, that the racial and sex discrimination, you never hear about intent of the founders, right? An African American brings a complaint, an equal protection case. Nobody says, gee, what would Thomas Jefferson think of equality for African Americans? Well, I don't know, the slave-owning Jefferson probably wouldn't be all that sympathetic. When a woman brings an equal protection case, nobody says, gee, you know, what would the framers think of equal rights for women? They'd probably be on the floor laughing, quite frankly, as enlightened as they were, that they were not that enlightened. They were living in the 18th century. They were enlightened for their time, but by today's standards, the framers, but an atheist brings a case, all of a sudden, you know, oh, the framers, that's all we hear about, right? So with equal protection, we can get rid of those intent of the founders arguments. Equal protection didn't exist in the founding era. So, and another thing with the Establishment Clause is we should realize that it's not inherently an identity-oriented remedy. We can see that by the fact that even a Christian can bring an Establishment Clause case to take a cross off of public property, right? If we saw that in the case of Salazar versus Buono out in the Mojave Desert, I think it was. There was a cross up, and a Catholic guy brought a case, Establishment Clause case, to bring it. He said, I want that cross down. I want it hanging in my church, but not on a public property. So there's no inevitable, inherent, identity-oriented aspect to an Establishment Clause case. So I really think we need to be mindful of that and realize the value of approaching our issues maybe from a standpoint of non-discrimination and equal rights, and not just the Establishment Clause. And let me just describe a little bit how this Massachusetts, the nuts and bolts of it, how it works. What we are doing is we're challenging a state law, okay, in state court, under the state constitution. We're challenging a state law that requires daily recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance in Massachusetts public schools. Why? Because it requires daily affirmation in a school-sponsored, teacher-led setting that declares the nation is under God. Okay? Therefore, we have a situation where the state is sponsoring something, where they are associating patriotism with God belief and actually disassociating atheism from patriotism. So, and that obviously is discriminatory towards atheists. It's indoctrinational by nature, right? The Pledge of Allegiance, all sides agree, is for the purpose of indoctrinating children, of instilling national loyalty. So we're instilling national loyalty in a context of affirming that we're one nation under God. That's discrimination. So I would say if equality means anything, right? Supposedly we have equal rights. If it means anything, it must mean that no child should go to school every single day for 13 years to have the state basically declaring that patriotism is defined in terms that draws a circle that leaves this child out. So the suit challenges what we call theistic supremacy, or theistic privilege, if you will. As I said, it's in state court. There's no federal element at all. There is a federal statute that declares the wording of the Pledge of Allegiance, but we're not challenging that statute. What we're saying is, let's suppose the federal government has the right to script anything it wants, okay? Well, if the state passes a statute requiring that to be recited in state schools, and it violates the State Equal Rights Amendment, then it's unconstitutional. Everything the federal government writes does not pass state constitutional scrutiny. This can be compared somewhat to the case from 10 years ago in Massachusetts. If any of you follow same-sex marriage litigation, you know the Goodridge same-sex marriage case here in Massachusetts was the first case in the nation to legalize same-sex marriage. And it did so just here in Massachusetts. When that case came down, obviously it only applied in Massachusetts, but the reverberations were felt from coast to coast, and it was very, very controversial. Well, Goodridge was a very similar case. It was an equal protection case brought in Massachusetts State Court under the Massachusetts State Constitution, challenging a state law, the state marriage laws. And what we found is that in Massachusetts, the state constitution has very serious equal rights language. We actually have an equal rights amendment here in Massachusetts that enumerates specifically that the state is not allowed to discriminate based on race, sex, national origin, or creed or religion. It expressly states right in the Constitution, no discrimination based on religion. By the way, the federal Constitution does not have that language. We have equal protection language in the federal Constitution under the 14th Amendment, but it doesn't specifically enumerate classes that can't be discriminated against. So we feel we have a very strong case. In fact, in Goodridge, there's no enumeration in the Massachusetts Constitution stating that there shall not be discrimination based on same-sex orientation, but the court found it anyway. Okay. Here, in our case, we have express ERA enumeration saying no religious discrimination. And we go in, we feel we have a very, very strong case. Probably the biggest obstacle we face is just the political unpopularity of siding with atheism, ruling against traditional pledge wording. But as far as the legal strength of the case goes, it's very, very strong. And we're hoping that it has a similar effect to the Goodridge case, as the Goodridge case had 10 years ago, where, you know, we start a conversation where people have to think, well, gee, you know, does the pledge discriminate based on religion? You know, does it discriminate against atheists? You know, I think if you ask anyone on the street, you know, does the Pledge of Allegiance favor believers? I think even believers would probably say, well, yeah, I guess it does. It says we're one nation under God. If you don't believe that, I guess you're really not, you know, you're not capable of truly saying the pledge, which is, you know, the patriotic exercise for most young people, right? So let's start a conversation and let's see where it goes. We're hoping that like Goodridge, we do that. So you could think of this case, it's called Doe versus Acton. You could think of Doe versus Acton as the atheist Goodridge, if you will. And along those lines, I would just urge, I don't stand at the podium and give advice very often, but I would throw out a few things that if you find this whole equality angle something that intrigues you and interests you, well, use it yourself. Keep in mind that we're not just standing around talking about church-state separation. We don't want to forget about that topic. I'm pro-church-state separation, but we need to really think about, what about our identity? Okay, the government should not be mingling with religion. Church-state separation, Jefferson's wall should be there, erected high, and it should be strong. But what about our demographic as a demographic? Well, what about atheists being equal Americans? That's a different topic. You see that the distinction between just arguing about this technical issue of whether the government crossed a line that it drew for itself, and the more identity-oriented issue of demanding a place at the table. But it's not like we are an identity that we should be ashamed of. That's oftentimes, I meet many atheists who will not identify as atheists. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. This is not news. But there's many people who do not believe in God who won't identify as atheists or even secular humanists. They say, I'm not religious, I don't want to talk about it. And that hurts us. If people who don't believe could have more of a cohesive identity that they're willing to assert. I think in this country, for some reason, identity politics are important. If you're a group that demands a place at the table as a group, you tend to get it, as long as you deserve it. And certainly our demographic deserves it. Statistically, all the statistics line up in our favor. You look at social problems and social ills, it's amazing how they all stack up on the side of more religious populations. Whether you're talking about murder rates, violent crime rates, just about anything, STD rates, the problematic statistics are align higher with more religious populations. And that applies when you're talking in this country, when you compare more religious states to less religious states, the social problems all stack up higher with more religious states. And it applies internationally when you compare the more religious United States to the less religious secular democracies of, say, Western Europe and other parts of the world. These social problems are all higher in the more religious societies. So we've got nothing to be embarrassed about or ashamed about, right? It's not that sort of thing at all. Over 90% of the National Academy of Sciences identifies as or holds atheist or agnostic religious beliefs. Is that something to be ashamed about? The way we are, the way we hide from our identity, you might think, that this was child molesters or something. I mean, we actually are a positive influence in American society, yet we're too often, I don't think people in this group, because you're attending an Atheist Alliance, but atheists in general are too ashamed of their identity. And that's shame versus pride is often the difference in social movements. Going back to the LGBT movement, what was holding the LGBT movement back? Well, it was basically understood in this country that you should be ashamed if you're gay or lesbian. It was something to be ashamed of. That was the overwhelming consensus, conventional wisdom. It's, oh my goodness, stay in the closet or try to change. That was the general feeling. But when that shame finally got swept aside, and there was a sense of gay pride, right? You turn the shame into pride, all of a sudden it's a force that can't be stopped. And if you look at just about any successful social movement, you'll see that's the phenomenon that happens. The acceptance of shame, the acceptance of second-class citizenship finally gets swept aside, and there's a sense of pride. Black pride, gay pride, whatever. Even the Rosie the Riveter with the feminist idea, of being, proud of who you are as a woman. It really is the turnaround point, and I think our movement, it hasn't reached that point, but I think we're at least beginning to realize that that's where we want to get. We need to be an identity-oriented. So identify openly yourselves as much as you can, and encourage other people who are non-religious, even if they don't like the atheist identity, at least identify, as agnostic or secular humanist or something other than I'm not very religious. And also, to the extent you can, demand equal access and equal time when you can. If you're in a group, in a community, get your spot in the 4th of July parade. Become visible some way. Point out theistic privileging when you can. If your Board of Selectmen starts praying, write a letter to the editor or complain to the selectmen and say, hey, you may think you're representing the entire town, but as far as I'm concerned, you're wasting 5 minutes at the beginning of your meeting by starting your meeting with a prayer. Speak out and let it be known. And of course, probably most importantly, to organize and be visible as groups. The more visibility we have, the less that we can be stopped. So, there's a saying in the feminist movement that feminism is the radical idea that women are people too. I'm sure you've heard that, right? Well, I like to think in our movement that the secular movement is the radical idea that non-believers are Americans too, right? And I think we really should realize that there are many people who do think that is a radical idea, that atheists and agnostics are not equal Americans, that they don't deserve a place at the table, that this is one nation under God. And we really need to push back against that. I'm sure we can do it, and I hope we see a lot of progress in the years to come. That's all I had for comments, but I'd be glad to chat.
Dave, great talk, by the way. Last week I saw something briefly online about Michelle Bachmann and some other Republicans complaining about the lawsuit because you were trying to do an end run around separation of church and state by filing this lawsuit as an equal protection lawsuit. I thought I read something about them trying to file an amicus brief.
They did, yeah. I knew I was on the right side of this case anyway, but when Michelle Bachmann came in on the other side, that sealed the deal. Yeah, in fact, their brief accused us. It was a brief signed by 36 congressmen, members of the House of Representatives, and they accused us of using this Massachusetts ERA strategy of gerrymandering our pleading. And I thought, I've got to be the first lawyer who's been accused by congressmen of gerrymandering. So, yeah, their brief was not very impressive, quite frankly. They didn't add any new arguments to the case or anything like that. But I think they just wanted to be on record for their constituents of opposing the lawsuit.
Can you tell me, are you aware of any public figures, famous people that are atheists, that have come out and said they're atheists, like the gay community has done?
Well, there are quite a few. There are definitely a lot of celebrities out there who are open about their atheism. Somebody had a presentation earlier today, and I forget who it was, but it flashed probably 24 faces on the screen of people who are open atheists, and they're kind of celebrities or quasi-celebrities. But, I mean, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt are both open atheists. Bill Nye. Pete Stark was a congressman, right. Barney Frank, that's really an interesting development, when Barney Frank's coming out. Are you all familiar with that? He was on Bill Maher's show about 2 or 3 weeks ago. He just retired from Congress, and now, having left Congress, he finally comes out as an atheist. And I think it's very interesting because he came out as gay in the early 1980s. It really goes to show the difference between the gay rights movement and the secular rights movement, is that he felt comfortable coming out as gay 30 years ago, and only came out as an atheist after leaving office.
This sounds like a very wise strategy, but I'm over here. But to play devil's advocate, I wanted to point out what some atheists may have concerns with regard to playing the identity politics on atheism. The reason we are atheists is because of rational considerations. It is a conclusion drawn the same way you would draw a conclusion for science, for economics, for politics, etc. And I have heard some people express concern that if we try to lump ourselves in with people, with feminism, with gay rights, or with race, that we are distancing ourselves from our rationales. How would you address this concern?
I really don't see the connection between identifying openly and having pride in secular identity and the concern that you raise. I don't see it as inconsistent, with the rationales that you talk about. I think we want to avoid being arrogant, and I don't think we want to stand up and say we're the only rational ones, or anything. That's just rude. The different people are more confrontational, and there are different ways to agitate. But I think as long as we are mindful of our manners, so to speak, and considerate of the context that we're in at any given time, that there shouldn't be any reason that identifying openly comes across as being inconsistent with what you're saying.
David, similar sort of theme there, but I cannot not be a woman, a heterosexual, white. I'm sorry, they're just my identity. I can't take that away from me. I can choose my belief system, whether I choose to do it through that argument. So I think that when we push the identity politics approach, which I think has got a lot of positive focus, I think we are going to have to choose our words carefully, the language and the branding. And I personally like that notion of I'm an American, right, to take it out of the religious frame, because it isn't quite the same. And I understand exactly why Barney Frank was more comfortable saying he was gay than saying he was an atheist in the political climate. So I think we are going to have to think carefully about the language we use to shape the identity politics strategy.
I agree with you. We do need to be very careful about how we. It's one thing to say we should identify openly, but going out into the world and doing it, there are innumerable possibilities and situations we're going to find ourselves in, and we do need to be somewhat careful and mindful. I agree. I would point out, though, that I don't think religious disbelief is as much of a choice as people say. I think there are a lot of complicated psychological factors involved but I don't think people really choose not to believe. I think there's just a level of whether we're honest with ourselves or not. But I'm not so sure. If I wanted to choose to believe right now, I don't think I could, right? I mean, you say your beliefs are a choice. I don't think I could believe that Jesus is God right now, even if I really, really tried hard. I just don't think, so I think we should realize that it's when somebody reaches a point, whether they believe or don't believe, I think there's really kind of a spectrum, that there are people who are more sure of themselves than others, but wherever somebody happens to be at a particular point in time is really a result of their genetic makeup and their experience in life, and they either at that point in time do or don't believe or fall somewhere on the spectrum, but I don't think choice is really much of a factor in that. Just something to think about.
I want to ask a question about timing. The Goodrich decision in 2003 prompted a whole bunch of marriage between a man and a woman, constitutional amendments in states across the country, including Ohio and probably a dozen or so others, that Karl Rove and others then used to mobilize the right against John Kerry in the 2004 election. And I wonder if you've thought about timing, and I'm not saying you shouldn't have done this now, lawsuits don't happen that way, but I have anxiety that we hand the far right yet another thing to say now the Northeast doesn't want to have a Pledge of Allegiance anymore, and because it's under God. And so they use that to help the far right do another 2010 in Congress and increase their strength. The timing of these are crucial things, and I don't know what the answer is. I'm asking the question.
Yeah, I don't pretend to have the final word on that either as far as, but I will tell you as far as timing goes, we really didn't have much of a choice. This, in fact, oral argument was originally scheduled for the spring. We were told to be ready in April and then again in May, but it just didn't make the calendar either time, so here we are. And there's probably no perfect time to stir the pot on a really controversial culture war issue, but you know, if we get the conversation going, we might be surprised at where it comes out. You know, one of the talking points of this lawsuit is that anyone who suggests that the plaintiffs who brought this case are unpatriotic is all wet. That these people care enough about how patriotism is defined to litigate to try to make sure that any daily patriotic exercise is inclusive. They want to be included. And that's something that really needs to be, that's a message point that we really want to get across. We care about how patriotism is defined. We're not anti-pledge. If they wanted to make the pledge one nation indivisible with liberty, justice for all, you know, that would be great. I know there are people who are just anti-pledge, and I can understand that because, you know, the idea of rote recitation is something that actually instills true patriotism is debatable. But the bottom line is we're looking for patriotism and we're looking for inclusion. We just want it done in a non-discriminatory way. And we might be surprised where the conversation goes once it gets going if we can get out there and talk about it.
Okay. Two things. We're not anti-pledge, we're anti-bastardized pledge.
That's right.
And have we thought about pitching the wall of separation as something that protects against discrimination?
Yes, well, in fact, an accurate Establishment Clause analysis would kind of take discrimination into account, but the way the pledge cases have gone under the Establishment Clause, with the exception of one Mike Newdow case back in 2002, I think it was, that went the right way in the Ninth Circuit, all the other cases have gone the wrong way. So I think the Establishment Clause as an avenue on this issue has kind of run out of gas. So this is another way of approaching the issue. But you're right, the current pledge is, did you call it a bastardized pledge? It's true, because as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the under God wording was added in 1954 during the McCarthy era. It was one nation indivisible before that.
I was talking socially, not legally, for discrimination protection.
What's that?
I was talking socially, not legally.
Okay. Anything else? I guess that's it. Oh, sorry.
I had one question. So I guess I'm kind of torn on the issue, but one of the complaints that I've heard with regard to, I guess, the religion clauses, so they were dormant for a very, very long time, and now we see this like sudden explosion of litigation surrounding the religion clauses. Do you think that, or do you see it as an issue of over-litigating the religion clauses to the point where it's setting bad law, because there's so many cases I guess being brought by, it's not just atheists, I guess the religious theists as well, where, you know, these decisions seem to be setting, for some people, it seems to be establishing bad law. Do you think that's an issue, or?
I do think it's an issue, yeah. I think there have been a few cases brought in recent years that in hindsight maybe shouldn't have been brought, but you know, I'm not going to stand here and be the decider, so to speak, about, you know, what the good choices and bad choices were, but there has been a lot of bad precedent. And I think there's a way to look at bad precedent, and that is, you know, again, go back to the gay rights movement. Before Goodridge, there were two important cases having to do with sodomy laws. Back around 1990 or so, there was a case called Bowers, where there was a sodomy law challenge, and the Supreme Court upheld the sodomy law, saying the state had the right to have anti-sodomy laws, which really didn't sit well with a lot of people because, you know, it's the modern age and we all believe that what people do in their bedrooms is their own business, you know, two consenting adults, that whole thing. And so the Bowers case sat for about 10 years until it was overturned by Lawrence v. Texas. And once Lawrence v. Texas was overturned, that kind of laid the groundwork for Goodrich. So I think bad precedent needs to be magnified and highlighted by those who really think it's bad precedent as an example of just how unfair and unjust it is. And, the cases that go the wrong way on the Establishment Clause are a good example. I mean, we should point to them. And how can you say that doesn't violate church-state separation? More directly in our case, how can you say that does not violate an atheist child's right to non-discrimination? And I think we need to agitate in that way and use bad precedents as something, as a talking point in our arsenal. Oh, I'm sorry, Abby.
And actually, a really good example of this privileging language that you've been talking about happened actually just down in Rhode Island when a young woman in high school asked to have a banner that talked about God in the high school gym be taken down. And the reaction was, the negative reaction included that her classmates during the pledge turned around and shouted "under God" to her when she asked for a simple taking down of a banner which was in violation of the separation clause. So the point is that this privileging language really is important, and it is equated with being good. So, I think that this is actually a very important thing to bring up, is the whole business of everyday acceptance of religious privilege, which really shouldn't be there.
That's absolutely right. In fact, the scenario she just described is accurate. Jessica Alquist, when she brought her church-state separation case, her entire class turned on her during the pledge, turned away from the flag to face her, to shout "under God" at her, to let her know that she's an outsider. We actually have an affidavit from Jessica on that exact scenario in our suit, because one of the arguments the other side makes is that the "under God" wording has nothing to do with religion at all. It's just it alludes to our heritage. It's heritage, history. The Declaration of Independence says our rights come from our Creator. It's very interesting. It's history and heritage, but there are no historical groups interested in this suit. There's just a laundry list of religious groups, the Knights of Columbus, the ACLJ, all these religious parties are coming in arguing that "under God" has nothing to do with religion. The fact that it validates their worldview is pure coincidence. It's so disingenuous. It's not. But with the Jessica Alquist affidavit, we can say, well, that's not how children understand the image. Ironically enough, any school child can tell you what "under God" means. It means we're one nation under God. It's not. It doesn't allude to the Declaration of Independence or anything like that.
We have time for a couple more questions.
It's true.
I think it's sort of worth exploring and looking at a little more on the Pledge of Allegiance itself and its origin. As was stated, Bellamy promulgated this thing as a private act, by a private citizen. It went through a number of proposed iterations after that, including one famous one by the Daughters of the American Revolution, but it never took hold. Interestingly enough, when Minister Bellamy retired, he retired down to the state of Florida and entered into a church down there to go to the service and found a totally segregated congregation. And the net result of all of this, that he was so appalled by what he saw in the churches in Florida that after that he never again entered another church for the rest of his life. Now, the other interesting thing is that in 1954, Congress took it upon itself during the McCarthy era and a very right-wing Republican representative to have the words "under God" added. And the political climate at the time, no one could really vote against that. But the interesting thing is, if you look at it, the Pledge of Allegiance was never, ever adopted by the U.S. government. So here we have the words, under God, inserted by the U.S. government to a pledge that was never promulgated by the U.S. government.
Many interesting things about the pledge, but the fact that it was actually written in 1892 to mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America, it was written by a Christian socialist who had no interest in